Welcome to the Big Game Hunting Podcast, where we help hunters like you prepare for the big game hunting adventures you've always dreamed of. Now, here's your host, John McAdams.
Hello, John McAdams here, and you are listening to episode 360 of the Big Game Hunting Podcast. I have a cartridge comparison for you today on two high-octane 22 caliber centerfire cartridges, the 22-250 Remington and the 22 Creedmoor. We will discuss the overall design characteristics and performance specs of each round, and then compare how they stack up next to each other. I will also cover how they each perform in some ballistic gel tests, and discuss some interesting aspects of how they performed at the range, and share a couple of anecdotes on how the 22 Creedmoor in particular has performed for me afield hunting feral hogs and whitetail deer. Before we get into that, I would greatly appreciate it if you would take just a couple of minutes to complete a listener survey of the Big Game Hunting Podcast and provide some feedback about the show. Tell me what you like about it, what topics you want covered in the future, what guests you want to have on the show, all that stuff. It'll just take you a couple minutes to fill out the survey, and your responses will help me plan future episodes to help me give you what you want more of in the future. And everyone who completes the survey will be entered in a random drawing for a $50 Cabela gift card. Link for the survey is in the show notes. Also, make sure you are on my email list. If you like the podcast, you will love the emails I send out every weekday about hunting, shooting, ballistics, etc. Sign up at the link in the show notes or go to biggamehuntingpodcast.com/ebook. Sign up there. You'll get my free ebook on the best hunting cartridges, and you'll also start to receive my emails. Okay, let's get started talking about the 22-250 and the 22 Creedmoor. We'll talk about their history and what they were designed to do briefly, then we'll dive into their performance specs. So we'll start with the 22-250. Developed all the way back in 1913, the 250-3000 Savage, sometimes known as the 250 Savage, was the brainchild of Charles Newton, and that was the first mass-produced rifle cartridge to break the 3,000 foot per second barrier. That was incredible performance at the time, but other designers recognized the potential for even faster velocities by necking the 250 Savage down to shoot even smaller diameter and lighter bullets than the 87-grain 257 caliber projectiles it used. Specifically, Wildcatters necked the Savage down to 22 caliber to build a round known as the 22 Varminter. Now, the Varminter was wildly popular, and it nearly matched the performance of the much larger 220 Swift. Leadership at the Remington Arms Company saw an opportunity in the market and standardized the Varminter as the 22-250 Remington in 1965. Capable of flinging 50-grain, 22 caliber bullets at velocities in excess of 3,700 feet per second, and firing lighter bullets at over 4,000 feet per second, the 22-250 also developed a reputation for an almost laser-flat trajectory, devastating performance on thin-skinned animals, mild recoil, and exceptional accuracy. Like they hoped, the cartridge turned into a massive commercial success for Big Green as varmint hunters snatched up factory 22-250 ammo and Model 700 rifles the company produced for their new round. Now, a 55-grain bullet at approximately 3,700 feet per second is a pretty standard load for the 22-250 these days. Now, as good as that cartridge is, though, hunters and shooters have long sought an alternative that further improves upon the already impressive performance of the old 22-250 Remington. In particular, one of the problems or one of the shortcomings with this round is that it typically uses lighter, low BC bullets that just don't do very well in windy conditions. Sure, you can push them really fast, and you don't need much, if any, holdover for shots at 200, 300 yards, etc. But if you're shooting in windy conditions, which is not unusual in some parts of the American West where there's really good coyote hunting, well, it can get pretty challenging to hit a target at longer range. For example, I have a friend who uses a 22-250 for culling game like springbok and blesbok in the open, wind-swept hills of South Africa's Free State province. He wants to minimize meat loss on those animals and to simplify his recovery efforts afterwards. So he uses a 55-grain VMAX in his 22-250 and he almost exclusively shoots those animals in the head. That setup works great for his purposes, and he can often take a couple of animals from the same herd at around 200 to 250 yards away, right? You get a nice steady rest with that rifle, put a suppressor on it, shoot these animals in the head, pop, pop, pop. They just go down instantly, and that is the end of it. But things can get really tricky when you're trying to make a headshot on an animal at that range if the wind picks up, and that often happens out there. Furthermore, those low BC varmint bullets the 22-250 uses also slow down rapidly and simply don't pack as much of a punch at longer range as many hunters wish they did. For instance, a guy named Derek Ratliff made a less than ideal shot on a coyote with his 22-250 while participating in a coyote hunting contest many years ago. As sometimes happens with a marginal shot like that, the creature spun around in a circle a few times, then took off. They eventually found the coyote, but the time they spent looking for it made Derek and his partner late to weigh in, and that cost them a not insignificant amount of prize money. That incident spurred Derek to search for another cartridge that would have dropped that coyote in its tracks. That is easier said than done. Coyotes are not very big, and Derek likens shooting one to trying to hit a moving 2-liter soda bottle turned sideways at an uncertain range. Plus, even though coyotes are not especially large creatures, they are pretty resilient and they are not always easy to instantly put down, especially with a marginal shot. Now, instead of shooting a light, fast bullet like the 22-250, he wanted something that would shoot heavy bullets at a slower, though still really fast velocity that would perform better in the wind, hit significantly harder downrange, and yet would also still have a flat trajectory like the 22-250. Now, he tried out a number of potential solutions before eventually finding one that worked better than the rest. It was a 6.5 Creedmoor case, neck down to 22 caliber, and shooting 75 grain Hornady AMAX bullets. Now, not only was that combination of a 75 grain AMAX in excess of 3,500 feet per second deadly on coyotes, but he also observed that it was still super flat shooting, really bucked the wind a lot better than, say, a 50 or 55 grain VMAX, and it also still had mild recoil. Convinced he had found the solution to his problem, Derek and the rest of the folks at Horizon Firearms spent the better part of the next decade refining their Wildcat cartridge. They eventually partnered with Hornady for help in tweaking load development, shepherding it through the SAMI standardization process, and getting it to the market. Their efforts eventually bore fruit when SAMI accepted the former Wildcat round in January 2024 as the 22 Creedmoor. Now, Hornady initially introduced 2 factory loads for the 22 Creedmoor shooting an 80 grain ELD-X and an 80 grain ELD match at an advertised velocity of 3,285 feet per second. So those are much heavier bullets than what is typical with, say, a 22-250, and they're going fast, but not nearly as fast as the 22-250 can shoot, say, a 50 or a 55 grain bullet. So now let's dive into the details of how these 2 rounds stack up next to each other. First, though both fire .224 caliber bullets, these 2 cartridges are best suited for dramatically different bullet weights and types. This is largely a function of the rifling twist rates most common in rifles chambered for each one. For instance, the 22 Creedmoor was designed from the start to use really long, heavy, high BC bullets and has a SAMI specified twist rate of 1 and 8 inches. Now, the 22 Creedmoor works really well with the 80 grain ELD match and 80 grain ELD-X from Hornady. Both bullets have a G1 BC of .485. The cartridge will also work with other heavy, long 22 caliber bullets like the 62 grain ELD VT, .395 BC, the 77 grain Sierra tipped Match King, .420 BC, and the Berger 80.5 grain full bore, .441 BC. All of those bullets, and some other ones, should work great with an off-the-shelf 22 Creedmoor rifle under a wide spectrum of conditions. Other bullets like the 77 grain Barnes LRX, Berger 85.5 long-range hybrid target, Hornady 88 grain ELD match, the Berger 90 grain VLD target, and the Hornady 90 grain A-tip can also potentially work, but they may require a barrel with a faster 1 in 7.5 or 1 in 7 inch twist rate under certain conditions for optimum performance. On the other hand, the 22-250 has a much slower SAMI specified twist rate of 1 in 14 inches. Now that twist rate makes the cartridge best suited for using lighter bullets. Stuff in the 35 to 55 grain range is most popular for that cartridge. Now we'll discuss this more later. Not all 22-250 rifles have that 1 in 14 inch twist rate. For instance, Bergara makes a 22-250 rifle with a 1 in 9 inch twist rate, and they can use some heavier bullets. Now, some companies like Horizon Firearms will actually even chamber their 22-250 rifles with a 1 in 8 inch twist rate. Now, hand loaders can potentially utilize heavier bullets for this cartridge when paired with a rifle with the appropriate twist rate, but the vast majority of 22-250 factory loads shoot lower BC, 35 grain, 40 grain, 50 grain, 55 grain, and maybe 64 grain bullets sometimes, depending on the bullet. This is due to the large numbers of older 22-250 rifles with that slower twist rate out there. Now, bullets like the 50 grain Hornady VMAX, .242 BC, the 50 grain Barnes TSX, .197 BC, the 55 grain Varmageddon from Nosler, .255 BC, and the 64 grain Winchester PowerPoint, .251 BC, are all pretty representative of projectiles common for the 22-250 in factory ammunition. Now, it is true you can get heavier and more aerodynamic bullets to work in this cartridge. For instance, Copper Creek loads ammunition for the 22-250 using some of those heavier bullets I just mentioned that were available for the 22 Creedmoor, right? So you could get a load from them with a Berger VLD, 80 grain Berger VLD, 88 grain Hornady ELD match, and say a 90 grain A-tip, stuff like that. The catch is, like I mentioned earlier, those really heavy bullets all require either a 1 in 8 or even a 1 in 7 inch minimum twist rate to stabilize. And those bullets are so large, they require a longer cartridge overall length that is as long as 2.55 inches. Now that brings me to my next point. The 22 Creedmoor has a SAMI specified cartridge overall length of 2.7 inches. The 22-250 has a SAMI specified overall length of 2.35 inches. Now, even those loads I listed earlier for the 22 Creedmoor using super heavy 90 grain bullets from, say, Copper Creek, for instance, have a maximum overall length of 2.66 inches or less. That fits comfortably within the overall length of the cartridge as specified by SAMI. However, since you have that really short 2.35 inch SAMI maximum overall length for the 22-250, you might need a special chamber design and or a longer rifle magazine for optimal performance and function in certain rifles with those really long bullets. To be fair, some rifles can accommodate bullets like that. As an example, the Bergara Crest Carbon in 22-250 utilizes a 6.5 Creedmoor size magazine, and I had no issues firing hand loads 2.5 inches long using the 62 grain ELD VT in that rifle. But not every 22-250 rifle can do that, though, especially some of the older models. But I can hear somebody thinking right now, John, I hear what you're saying, but what if I do have a 22-250 rifle with a fast 1 in 7 or 1 in 8 inch twist rate? And what if my chamber and magazine can't accommodate ammunition with those bullets? Surely it can hang with the 22 Creedmoor, right? Well, not quite. The 22 Creedmoor also has a larger case capacity than the 22-250. Now, both cartridges have similar sized cases, but the 22 Creedmoor has a slightly larger SAMI spec case head diameter, 0.470 inches versus 0.4668 inches, much less body taper, and a slightly longer case, 1.92 inches versus 1.912 inches. Additionally, the 22 Creedmoor has a 30-degree shoulder angle, while the 22-250 Remington has a 28-degree shoulder angle. Add it all up, and the 22 Creedmoor has about 15% more case capacity than the 22-250. So I sat down and I measured the powder capacity of 5 individual 22 Creedmoor and 22-250 expended cases. Hornady brass for both. On average, 22 Creedmoor case capacity was 51.5 grains of water. 22-250 case capacity, 45.7 grains of water. For what it's worth, Chuck Hawks lists an even lower 22-250 case capacity of 44.6 grains of water using Winchester brass. Joseph von Benedict actually lists a slightly higher figure of 52.6 grains of water for the 22 Creedmoor case capacity in an article he wrote for Rifle Shooter magazine. So with all that in mind, I think it's pretty safe to say the 22 Creedmoor has about 6 to 8 grains more case capacity than the 22 250. That extra powder capacity means that, all other things being equal, the 22 Creedmoor can fire the same weight bullet faster than the 22 250. But also, to be fair, the 22 250 does have a slightly higher SAAMI maximum average pressure of 65,000 psi versus 62,000 psi for the Creedmoor. So how does all that stuff shake out? To illustrate this, we'll compare a couple different loads here. So for the 22 Creedmoor, we'll compare an 80 grain ELDX load. Now the ELDX and ELD match loads have the exact same ballistics, same weight, bullet, with the same BC at the same velocity, so they translate 1-to-1. I'll just use the ELDX here. I'll compare that to a couple of popular varmint loads for the 22 250 and a load for the 22 250 shooting an 80 grain ELDX. Now the 22 Creedmoor shoots that 80 grain ELDX at 3,285 feet per second. That's pretty fast, and that's a pretty high BC bullet, but it's not going nearly as fast as these loads for the 22 250. So we'll see how it performs. So for the 22 250, we'll use a run-of-the-mill 55 grain load from Hornady's Varmint Express line. That load shoots a 55 grain VMAX, BC .255. That is a very typical 22 250 Predator load. It's very similar to what you'll see from other companies like Federal, Nosler, Remington, and Winchester. We'll also use two high-performance 22 250 loads from Hornady's Superformance Varmint line. One shooting a 35 grain NTX with a .170 BC at a blazing fast 4,450 feet per second, and another shooting a 50 grain VMAX .242 BC at a smoking 4,000 feet per second. Now that 50 grain VMAX load is about as good as you will find for a high-performance 22 250 factory load, and it gives close to the best balance of trajectory, wind deflection, and retained energy downrange that you will get from a factory load for this cartridge. Now, like I mentioned earlier, I will also compare another 22 250 load using an 80 grain ELDX bullet. Hornady does not offer that bullet in a factory load for the cartridge, but Copper Creek does, and they actually sell this as a custom hand load. It is important to note that, like I mentioned earlier, the 80 grain ELDX and ELD match are both really long, and when you load it in the 22 250, it has a specified overall length of 2.5 inches. That is too long to fit in a typical 22 250 rifle magazine. You also need a faster 1 1/8 inch twist rate. That's why you can't get it as a factory load from a big manufacturer, but it will work in the right rifle if it is set up properly. So when you look at the ballistics for all of those loads, a couple things are apparent. So first, the three 22 250 loads firing varmint bullets all start out with a faster muzzle velocity, but all have a much lower BC than the 80 grain bullets. The end result is those four loads, so the three varmint loads for the 22 250 with the 22 Creedmoor 80 grain load, are all actually neck and neck in the trajectory department. The 50 grain VMAX is a little flatter shooting than the rest, but it is still only hitting about 2 inches higher than the 22 Creed at 500 yards. The 22 Creedmoor also has a slightly flatter trajectory than the 35 grain NTX and the 55 grain VMAX, even though those two loads with the lighter bullets start off with a muzzle velocity advantage of 1,165 feet per second and nearly 400 feet per second, respectively. Yes, even that 22 250 load with a muzzle velocity over 1,000 feet per second faster has basically the same trajectory as the 22 Creedmoor out at 500 yards. Now, at 500 yards, the 22 Creed bullet is going about 450 feet per second faster than the 50 and 55 grain bullets from the 22 250, and over 600 feet per second faster than that stumpy little 35 grain NTX. The 22 Creedmoor also just blows away all three varmint bullets in the wind deflection category and requires a little more than half the wind hold of the 50 and 55 grain loads and just over a third of the wind hold for the 35 grain load. The 22 Creedmoor actually has less wind deflection at 500 yards than those three varmint loads do at 400 yards. Furthermore, the 80 grain ELDX puts a whole lot more energy on target than the 22-250 loads. Now that is true at the muzzle, and the difference only increases with range. That load retains over twice the energy of the VMAX loads and over 4 times the kinetic energy of the NTX load at 500 yards. So the 22 Creedmoor has virtually the same trajectory, but has much better performance in the wind and retains much more energy than the 22-250 does downrange when using those varmint bullets. Now, to illustrate this point further, if you fired those 4 loads at the exact same time at the same target, the 80 grain ELDX will pass the 55 grain VMAX in the air around the 300 yard mark, will pass the 35 grain NTX around 450 yards, and will pass the 50 grain VMAX around 550 yards downrange. Add it all up, it is easy to see why the 22 Creedmoor appeals to so many hunters. It gives you all the things people like about the 22-250, especially that flat trajectory, but dramatically improves upon the performance of the 22-250 in the wind and in the effects on target categories when you're using a varmint bullet for the 22-250. That is a great example of what using a much higher BC bullet will do for you. I'll share some gel test results and some examples from the range to further illustrate these points shortly. Before we move on to that, though, let's talk about the 22-250 load with that 80 grain bullet. Like I mentioned earlier, the 22 Creedmoor has a larger case capacity that will hold more powder. That means it can push the same weight bullet faster. In this particular case, the 22 Creedmoor has about a 200 foot per second muzzle velocity advantage when both are shooting the same weight bullet. Right, Copper Creek advertises 30-80 feet per second for this special hand load with the 22-250. Hornady's loading that same weight bullet at 32-85. So that 200 foot per second, more or less, difference in performance is about what you get between a 308 and a 30-06, or a 30-06 and a 300 Win Mag with typical factory loads. So in other words, the 22 Creedmoor still has a significant advantage over the 22-250 in performance. To be fair, the 22-250 load with that 80 grain bullet does perform much better than those varmint loads in the wind deflection and retained energy categories, though it does lag a little in the trajectory department. Now, it's also worth noting that that is a pretty hot hand load for the 22-250, and I'm comparing it to a more sedate factory load that Hornady just isn't standing on very hard. For what it's worth, Copper Creek also lists a load for the 22 Creedmoor shooting an 80 grain ELDX at 3,400 feet per second. So yes, users can dramatically improve the performance of the 22-250 at extended range with a custom rifle, magazine, and hand load designed to accommodate those higher BC bullets, and you can still fire them with a high degree of accuracy. They'll still fall a little short of the 22 Creedmoor, but you'll come close. Now, taking the additional step of bumping up to something like a 22-250 Ackley Improved will further narrow the gap between the 22-250 and the 22 Creedmoor. We'll talk more about this in a minute, but that's a lot of custom steps a person needs to take. Yes, you can do it, but the more you head in that direction with the custom rifle, custom magazine, hand loads, etc., the further you are getting away from the traditional 22-250 rifles and ammo, and you're giving up the advantages that cartridge has in rifle and ammo availability. Or you can just skip all of that hassle if you want a really high-performing 22 caliber centerfire and get an off-the-shelf 22 Creedmoor rifle and use factory ammunition. We'll talk more about this in a minute.
I'm no tech genius, but I know if I want my business to crush it, I need a website now. Thankfully, Bluehost makes it easy. I customized, optimized, and monetized everything exactly how I wanted with AI. Within minutes, my site was up. I couldn't believe it. Plus, Bluehost keeps me protected 24/7. No more worrying about hackers. I just relax and focus on my customers. So, whatever your hustle may be, secure your online presence in 2025 with Bluehost. Head to Bluehost.com to start now.
Now, before we move on, I do want to acknowledge that Hornady has gotten in hot water for some of their other ammo, namely for the 7 PRC, failing to achieve anywhere near their published velocities. That has not been my experience with the 22 Creedmoor. All of the ammo I have shot for it has achieved velocities very close to what Hornady has claimed out of my rifle. And that rifle does have a 24-inch long barrel. Now, circling back to comparing ballistics of these two cartridges. A 3 to 4 inch difference in the point of impact from wind deflection, which is about the advantage the 80 grain ELDX has over the high performance 50 grain VMAX at just 300 yards, could easily be the difference between a hit to the vitals that drops a coyote in its tracks versus a hit that is not immediately lethal and allows the coyote to escape. Not only do those factors make it easier to hit a target at long range, but the 22 Creedmoor also simply hits a whole lot harder. That can make a big difference in minimizing wounding loss and just quickly killing animals. This was on display during a trip to the range where I shot both my 22 Creedmoor and 22 250 out to 500 yards. It was a little windy that day, not terrible, but not calm either. But I did not have any issues hitting targets out to 400 and 500 yards with the 22 Creedmoor. In fact, I took my very first shot of the day with that rifle at a small circular plate at 400 yards, and I drilled it almost dead center. The range officer was impressed and told me he very rarely sees anyone do that with their first shot at the range on that target. Now, I was also shooting the 50 grain VMAX load out of the 22 250 on that same trip. I brought a Bergara Crest carbon rifle. That rifle really shoots that ammo extremely accurately. The 200 and 300 yard targets were a piece of cake, but I really had to work harder to hit those targets at 400 and 500 yards with the 22 250. And I observed about a foot of wind deflection at 500 yards with that 50 grain VMAX. But things were just a lot different with the 22 Creedmoor. I needed to account for significantly less wind deflection to hit the target, right, just a couple of inches, and my hits were obvious due to the dramatically greater visual effects of the bullets impacting. Shooting steel is not the same as shooting an animal, but that additional retained energy downrange for the Creedmoor can result in a more devastating wound cavity that is more likely to quickly kill an animal. So speaking of which, I have shot both cartridges into ballistic gel. Now, just like you would expect, the 22 250 produced a very wide, shallow wound cavity with a 50 grain VMAX. That stuff performed almost exactly like you would expect. I also shot a 64 grain Winchester PowerPoint load for the cartridge that is better suited for deer hunting into the gel. That bullet penetrated deeper than the VMAX, about 13 inches of penetration versus 6 to 7 for the VMAX, but that bullet delivered a more narrow wound. I also shot the 80 grain ELDX for the 22 Creedmoor into gel. That load made a wound cavity about as wide as the VMAX that was also more than twice as long. Plus, it penetrated significantly deeper than even the 64 grain PowerPoint. Long story short, the 22 Creedmoor produces a much larger volume wound and also penetrates better than those 22 250 Remington loads. How does that translate into performance afield? I've shot 2 feral hogs and a whitetail deer with the 80 grain ELDX bullets from the Creedmoor. One hog and the deer dropped instantly at the shot. One of the hogs took 2 to 3 steps before falling over. I actually shot that hog a little bit too far back, but because the wound cavity was so large and devastating on it, even though my shot was not great on it, that wound cavity still caused significant damage to the vital organs of that animal, and it, like I said, it only went a handful of steps afterwards. Every single bullet exited those animals after causing immense damage to their vital organs. Okay, now let's talk about recoil. Now, the 22 Creedmoor has about 45% more free recoil energy than the 22 250. Yes, that is quite a bit more, but to be perfectly honest, both cartridges have very mild recoil. Virtually any person, regardless of size or age, should be able to handle them with ease. Even the higher recoiling 22 Creedmoor load still has less than 10 foot-pounds of free recoil energy out of an 8.5-pound rifle. That's not much at all. All right, so where do we stand overall? The 22 250 fires a lighter bullet at a blazing fast velocity, while the 22 Creedmoor fires a heavier and much higher BC bullet at a slightly slower velocity. The end result is the two cartridges have a similar trajectory, but the 22 Creedmoor has much more retained kinetic energy, much better resistance to wind deflection, and more recoil. Now let's talk about the logistics of operating both of these cartridges. So the 22 250 is by far the most popular of the two, both in terms of rifles and ammo. Now, talking about ammo first, Basically, every ammo manufacturer of note produces a wide variety of ammo for the 22-250. Most of those loads use a varmint bullet. Virtually every major style of varmint bullet is available in either a factory load or as a component bullet. Right, you got the Barnes varmint grenade, the Hornady NTX and VMAX, the Nosler ballistic tip varmint and Varmageddon, the Remington AccuTip V, the Spear TNT, the Winchester Varmint X, just to name a few. Now, the 22-250 is also available in a few loads designed for hunting bigger game, right? You can get it, for instance, in the Barnes Vortex line with a 50-grain TSX bullet. Winchester also offers it in their PowerPoint line with 64-grain bullets. Hornady was initially the only company manufacturing factory 22 Creedmoor ammo, but Nosler has also recently picked up the cartridge. Now, Hornady offers 3 loads for it, an offering in the Superformance line firing a 60-grain CX bullet that is a lead-free monolithic projectile. They offer it in their Precision Hunter line with an 80-grain ELDX, and they also offer it in their Match line with an 80-grain ELD match bullet. Nosler produces 22 Creedmoor ammo with their 70-grain Accubon bullet in their trophy grade line. They also make it in their Match line with an 85-grain reduced drag factor bullet. Now, to be fair, hand loaders can also use all of the 22 caliber component bullets I just mentioned for the 22-250 in the 22 Creedmoor. And in addition to all those bullets I just mentioned, hand loaders can also use a couple of others I haven't talked about yet that may require a faster twist barrel, right? You can use a 60-grain Nosler Partition, 65-grain Sierra Game King, and a 68-grain Hammer Hunter, among some others. As an example, Nosler recommends a 1 and 12-inch twist rate for their 60-grain Partition. That is a little bit faster than what you'll find with older rifles for the 22-250 with that 1 and 14-inch twist rate. Some rifles can use it, like my Bergara, for instance, so you can make a hand load with that, but it will work easily with the 22 Creedmoor as well. Now, also, in addition to Hornady and Nosler, Alpha Munitions, ADG, and Peterson all make 22 Creedmoor brass. Okay, now let's talk about rifles. Situation very similar to the ammo situation. The 22-250 easily beats the 22 Creedmoor in terms of rifle availability. It is available in darn near every bolt-action rifle you can think of, right? The Bergara Crest, Bergara Sierra, the Howler 1500, Mossberg Patriot, Remington 700, Ruger American, Ruger Hawkeye, Savage Axis, Winchester Model 70, all that stuff. Like I mentioned, I have a Bergara Crest Carbon in 22-250. I've shot it a lot. I really like it. Now, that rifle utilizes Bergara's new Cure Carbon barrel. It shoots like nobody's business. It is a little bit unusual in the 22-250 rifle space in that it has a 20-inch long barrel and utilizes a 1 and 9-inch twist rate. That is an in-between twist rate, faster than what you'll traditionally see with the round, but not quite fast enough to shoot the really high BC 22 caliber bullets the 22 Creedmoor excels with. That rifle really likes the 50 and 55 grain Hornady VMAX bullets. Accuracy was excellent with both. I also tried it with a hand load shooting a 62 grain ELD VT. Accuracy was not as good as with the VMAX bullets, but it also performed reasonably well. But to be fair, that bullet is a little outside what is considered optimal for that twist. You really need either a 1 and 7 or 1 and 8 twist rate for optimum stability with that ELD VT bullet, according to both Hornady and the Berger online stability calculator when I ran the numbers on it. Okay, now let's switch gears, talk about 22 Creedmoor rifles. Horizon Firearms currently offers the cartridge in their Villain, Vandal, and Fanatic rifles. Fierce Firearms also chambers the cartridge in a couple of their rifle lines as well. Other companies will probably start offering rifles in the cartridge soon, but that's basically it for 22 Creedmoor rifles at this instant. And neither Fierce nor Horizon are known for producing rifles at lower price points either. So the 22-250 is currently the much better choice if you are on a limited budget. I do have a Horizon Fanatic rifle chambered in 22 Creedmoor. I think it's fantastic. They offer the 22 Creedmoor with either a 22 or 24-inch long benchmark barrel with a removable muzzle brake. It's threaded 5/8 24 in that model line. You can pair it with a Stiller Wombat Action, TriggerTech trigger, carbon iota stock. That rifle has a premium price point, but it is also an excellent rifle with lots of premium components. My goodness, does it shoot too. Horizon also offers the 22 Creedmoor in their Villain and Vandal rifles. Both of those rifles sport a shorter 18-inch long barrel in that chambering. You will lose some muzzle velocity by dropping down to a shorter barrel like that, probably 30-50, 30-75 feet per second with an 80 grain bullet, but those rifles are also fantastically compact and easy to maneuver. All right, what about barrel life of these two cartridges? Barrel life is a function of a couple different factors, right? The quality of the barrel in question, whether or not the user maintains it properly, how quote-unquote hard the user runs that rifle, right? Like if they're shooting really long shot strings versus letting the barrel cool completely after a few shots. You also need to take into account your bore diameter, the powder charge, and the pressure of the ammunition used. Let's assume we are dealing with barrels of similar quality that are used and maintained in a similar manner. If we put those things aside, smaller bore diameters, use with higher pressure loads, and use with larger powder charges are all associated with shorter barrel life. The reverse is also true. So with those things in mind, the two cartridges both have the same bore diameter. The 22-250 is a slightly higher pressure round, but the 22 Creedmoor uses more powder. Jaden Quinlan from Hornady put together a spreadsheet of estimated barrel lives for a wide spectrum of cartridges based on these factors. He estimated a barrel life for the 22-250 ranging from 950 rounds to 1777 rounds, with an average of about 1,500 rounds of barrel life if you are primarily shooting factory loads or moderate hand loads in your rifle, and that will drop down to about 1,200 rounds if you are shooting lots of spicy hand loads. Now, Jaden did not include the 22 Creedmoor in that spreadsheet, but Derek from Horizon Firearms said that Jaden calculated an average barrel life for the 22 Creedmoor of about 1,300 rounds for those using hotter loads and about 1,800 rounds for those using factory ammo, based on that same criteria. For what it's worth, Derek has also stated he has personally seen 3 different 22 Creedmoor barrels, quote-unquote, wear out and start shooting larger groups around the 1,300, 1,580, and 1,700 round marks. That jives pretty close to what Jaden estimated. That's a long way of saying the 22-250 and 22 Creedmoor have virtually identical barrel life. Both cartridges are rougher on barrels because they are smaller caliber and higher pressure loadings using a larger amount of powder for their bore diameter. All right, there's no guarantee every single rifle will perform in the same manner here either. Some may experience a drop-off in accuracy sooner. Others may continue to obtain great accuracy from a rifle that has exceeded those thresholds. But in general, hunters can expect the best possible accuracy from their 22-250 and 22 Creedmoor rifles that are short of the 1,200 to 1,700 round mark. And that will last a long time for most people. Okay, so which cartridge is best for you? There's a lot of overlap in their capabilities, but these two cartridges each have the advantage in a couple different areas. So are you looking for an all-around varmint or predator hunting cartridge? Both the 22 Creedmoor and the 22-250 are outstanding rounds for hunting predators and varmints like prairie dogs and coyotes. The 22 Creedmoor has a flat trajectory. It performs great in windy conditions and carries significantly more energy out to extended range, so it has an edge as distances increase. I also think the 22 Creedmoor is a better choice for use on bigger creatures like coyotes. In fact, I think the 22 Creedmoor is a nearly ideal choice for coyote hunting. This is especially true for hunters pursuing coyotes at night with a thermal sight and or in windy conditions. Right, that's often the case for those hunting out west. It is tough to obtain an accurate range at night, and determining whether you are looking at a small animal up close or a larger animal farther away can be pretty tricky through a thermal. But the fact that the 22 Creedmoor shoots basically as flat as the 22-250, but also just performs significantly better in the wind and flat out hits harder can really come in handy under those conditions. Those characteristics can make it easier to place shots more accurately on coyotes under certain conditions, right? Especially when it's windy. And additionally, it's also just more likely to anchor a coyote with even a less than perfect shot. It works great at shorter range, but the 22 Creedmoor really stands apart from the 22-250 in open country where longer shots are a possibility. And as that range increases, the 22 Creedmoor becomes a better choice that is more likely to put a coyote down for good, both with solid and less than ideal shot placement than the 22-250. Now, I'm not saying the 22 Creedmoor gets better as range increases, but I am saying its advantage over the 22-250 increases as the range increases. The same is also true for different shot angles. Like I mentioned earlier, that 80 grain ELDX produced a longer wound track that was nearly identical in diameter to the one the 50 grain VMAX from the 22-250 made in ballistic gel. That can potentially pay dividends with less than ideal shot placement. The same is also true for a shot on an animal running directly away from the shooter. Derek Ratliff demonstrated this on a hunt in New Mexico during 2024, where he scored a coyote double with his 22 Creed. Both dogs instantly dropped at the shot, to include one that stopped and looked back that he had to shoot through the entire length of the body to reach the vitals. Now, a 50 or 55 grain VMAX from a 22-250 would still probably have crippled that animal if it did not kill it outright with that shot angle. But the deeper penetration and longer wound cavity of that 80 grain ELDX is more likely to cause devastating damage to the vitals of that animal, kill it faster, and reduce the odds it runs off and dies in the woods where it's harder to find. Sometimes that matters, sometimes it doesn't. But if that's important to you, then the 22 Creedmoor is the better choice. On the downside, I can certainly see the 22 Creedmoor as being rougher on fur than the 22-250. I mean, they can both be pretty rough on fur depending on the details. But I'll say that if your goal is to quickly kill a predator or varmint and minimize wounding loss, like during a coyote hunting contest, then the 22 Creedmoor is the round for you. I would not recommend the 22 Creedmoor, at least not with those 80 grain bullets, if I were trying to sell the furs of any animals afterwards. None of this is to say the 22-250 isn't a deadly coyote round. It remains incredibly effective in that role and is as potent as it ever was on coyotes at extended range. If anything, improvements in ammunition have allowed hunters to squeeze even more performance out of that case than was possible 50 years ago. So I'm not saying it's a bad choice for that role by any means. It's just that I think the 22 Creedmoor is a little better. But what if you're hunting in an area where you're unlikely to take a longer shot? Good question, right? The 22-250 is an incredibly flat shooting cartridge itself. You don't need much holder at all or much wind hold if you're shooting inside 300 yards. If you're hunting in thicker country and you're not going to be shooting much further than that anyway, then the 22-250 isn't giving much up to the 22 Creedmoor. Yeah, the 22 Creedmoor is the more powerful cartridge still, but I'm doubtful you will see a significant difference in results if you shoot a coyote at 100 yards that has 1,700 foot-pounds of energy versus 1,300 foot-pounds of retained energy. You're probably looking at a dead dog either way. When it comes to hunting smaller animals like prairie dogs, now the 22 Creedmoor does have advantages with wind deflection that can really come in handy. Prairie dogs are not big creatures. Misjudging your wind hold by as little as 2 inches can easily be the difference between a hit or a miss. Just keep in mind that neither cartridge is ideal for longer shot strings. Barrel life is lower for both cartridges than something like a 223, and you can really eat into that more limited barrel lifespan with a few prairie dog hunts where you shoot a bunch of ammo and really heat up your barrel. Now, furthermore, the 22-250 has a gigantic advantage over the 22 Creedmoor when you consider the cost, availability, and selection of rifles and ammo. The fact remains that there's a very limited supply of factory loads and rifles available for the 22 Creedmoor right now. Now, all of those rifles available right now, as I record this, all retail for over $2,000. 22 Creedmoor ammo is also about twice as expensive as 22-250 ammo. On the other hand, you can buy a Ruger American Predator in 22-250, slap a Vortex scope on it, buy some inexpensive ammo from Federal or Winchester for $20 to $25 a box, and get out coyote hunting for less than $1,000 for everything right now. When you consider that, the 22-250 just blows the 22 Creedmoor out of the water in this area while absolutely being good enough for use in most coyote hunting situations. Good enough actually may be underselling it. I would even say it is great for many coyote hunting situations. The 22 Creedmoor certainly offers advantages over the 22-250, but you have to pay extra to get that extra performance, and it's really up to you to determine whether the juice is worth the squeeze. Now, what if you want a cartridge ideal for hunting bigger game like feral hogs and deer? Assuming 22 caliber cartridges are legal to hunt big game where you live, both will work. I think the .22 Creedmoor is a clear winner of these two rounds for hunting big game. Like I mentioned earlier, the 80 grain ELDX will typically penetrate deeper and make a larger wound cavity than most .22-250 big game hunting loads, and I have had great results afield with the .22 Creedmoor on deer and hogs. That being said, the .22-250 can definitely work in this role too. I know a lot of hunters who have used it as a deer cartridge with really good results. Now, are you looking for a cartridge with lots of inexpensive ammo for target shooting or just a fun general plinking cartridge for use at the range? Neither is a great choice if you want to shoot soda cans in the field behind your house, right? Get a .223 or a .22 long rifle for that. But the .22-250 will be easier on your wallet than the .22 Creedmoor. For serious precision shooting at long range, the .22 Creedmoor is the way to go. The ELD match is a wonderful all-around target shooting load. It does great at longer range. Are you very sensitive to recoil? Both are pretty light recoiling, but the .22-250 Remington definitely has less recoil than the .22 Creedmoor. But like I said, even the .22 Creedmoor doesn't recoil that much. In fact, my 8-year-old son actually shoots my .22 Creedmoor especially well. It's possible he will shoot his first deer with it one day. Now, though the differences between these two cartridges are very significant in some respects, both are highly capable predator cartridges that can also make the jump up to bigger game. The .22 Creedmoor is a modern round that has a lot going for it for those wanting to squeeze everything they can out of a .22 caliber centerfire. But don't count out the old .22-250 Remington either, which is a proven performer with a massive advantage in terms of ammo and rifle availability and cost. Now, as usual, I have written a pretty detailed article about these cartridges for the Big Game Hunting blog. There is a link to that article in the show notes if you want to check it out. I've also put links to articles I've written about other accessories like hearing protection, slings, scopes, etc. Check out those URLs to learn more about those things. Don't forget to complete the listener survey either. The link for that is also in the show notes. And you can provide feedback on the show and tell me what you want to hear in the future by filling out that survey. Remember, you can make your dream hunt turn into a reality, and I can help. Thanks for listening, and I will see you back here next time on the Big Game Hunting Podcast.
This show may be over, but we have plenty more for you on our website. For more information on today's topic, as well as lots of other useful hunting resources, head over to the BigGameHuntingBlog.com. We look forward to having you back for the next episode. But until then, happy hunting.